So here we are to talk today about the crash of 2008. We'd like to make some remarks that will be supplementary to the account that's given in Frieden and the account that you'll have in the film Panic, the untold story about the crisis of the financial crisis of 2008. So frequently they will refer to it in various ways: a financial crisis, a great crisis. Very few people say crash. I like to say crash of 2008. But at any rate, I think the Frieden account, very, very spare, but not too bad. And I invite you to compare what's being said by Frieden and with what's going to be said today about the crash. And the film Panic, I think, is absolutely splendid as far as it goes, and really a superb piece of historical narration, very good on the chronology, and tells the story by interviews with all of the participants. And so, I mean, for a historian, you can't beat that. So that really absolutely superb, except when it gets to the end, it kind of avoids a gigantic point and permits a very big distortion. The point that it makes at the end is that the big banks and financial institutions that had brought us this enormous crash were bailed out by the federal government, but that the institutions took the money and, presumably engaged in splendid business and all the rest of that, as they were supposed to do, and were able to pay it all back with interest. And so you get the impression that, it was just a little temporary problem that the banks and institutions, other institutions had in this financial crisis. And it leaves us out entirely the issue of quantitative easing, money printing, because in addition to this federal bailout, which is the thing that nearly all the literature asks us to concentrate our attention on, there was an enormous handout given by the Federal Reserve in a direct sense in the buying up of bonds and other obligations, commercial paper and all the rest of that, which amounted to money in the, I don't know, maybe tens of trillions. I've seen various accounts of this, and this is completely apart from the federal bailout that the institutions got from Congress. The thing about which the whole story is told makes you almost think that the bailout, so-called bailout that they're telling you about, is practically a footnote to the story, and that the reason that they were able to pay the money back was that the Fed, Ben Bernanke, the federal government, I should say the Federal Reserve, was giving them money for several years after that, and continues to this day to dish out this money under the rubric of quantitative easing. And this indeed is the way the post-crash economy has been running, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Japan. So this is a big part of the story that is, I must say, omitted and really in the end distorted at the end of this film when they let it pass, when they say the banks paid it all back. So there we go. So it's a very good film up to that point, I think, and it does miss on that point. Frieden does not miss on that point. Frieden makes the point about quantitative easing, and his is a pretty straightforward account, very much more useful for us, I think, than the film in the final analysis, although the film is so good on the detail. Anyhow, so you have a lot on this, and so I should make some remarks about it. Let me say, first of all, about globalism, that we've been charting the decade prior to the turn of the 21st century, and really prior to the big change that occurs in international politics as a result of the events of 9/11, events which have really changed the politics of the Middle East and really the whole period ever since. We've had what people nowadays are calling unending wars as a result of these events of 9/11. So we've talked about that period in terms of a number of big changes, and I think we ought to bear a couple of them in mind In general terms, so bear a couple of these changes in mind as we proceed into our discussion of what amounts to the first decade of the 21st century, as we'll do today. And I think a couple of those things are, for example, Russia. Russia, in effect, was a key component, the central component, I argued, the central component in this construction of a globalized model. And really the slogan of globalism really does not have much weight until the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapses, and when you really don't have another superpower, then the slogan of globalism really starts to take on genuine meaning. And I guess it's no accident that it became such a widely discussed idea during the 90s, and so much literature. It becomes a title of so many books. Globalization is on everybody's mind and right in the front of their consciousness in a way that it couldn't be without. And the reason for that is that not only are these great spoils available, but the Soviet Union has bought into the globalized system and is taking advice throughout the 1990s under the regime of Boris Yeltsin, and especially under the foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev. They are doing everything that the United States asks of them. So there's this kind of intimacy and slavishness almost in the Soviet perspectives on economic policy that ends at the end of the 20th century. Now, why does it end? We'll talk more about that on another occasion, but we were pretty much getting to the point when we discussed the destruction of Yugoslavia. I think that is more or less the setting for it. But also there's an economic crisis that globalization turns out to be too much for the Russian economy to keep track of. And in the end, when the crash of 1998 occurred, the devaluation of the ruble and the economic crisis in Russia coming to a head at virtually the same time, and perhaps as a kind of reflection of the Southeast Asian crises that we mentioned briefly and about which Frieden speaks. And when that happened, there's a kind of a feeling that the economic policy has run aground too. So there's not only the defection of the Soviet Union because of watching NATO and the United States mainly destroy Yugoslavia, and particularly in the heinous way that they did it, ending with this 80-day bombing of Bill Clinton bombing Belgrade. Bear in mind, there hadn't been any bombing in Europe since World War II. So this is really quite a moment for the Russians to swallow. And you remember their traditional affinity for the Serbs. Tsarist Russia got into World War I defending the Serbs. So there is this kind of traditional kind of feeling of kinship on some vague level with the Serbs, and so it's the Serbs who end up getting blamed and criminalized, really demonized for the whole process that destroyed Yugoslavia, when really it's to a great degree imposed from without. This is something we could drop everything and discuss practically for the rest of the semester. It has a lot of fascinating details, very important for understanding European history, but our topic is larger than that, and so the topic can't detain us. Anyhow, the point is, though, that the main point, that bottom line, is that Russia is lost in the 21st century. Russia was a key component of the globalization, really at its height in the 1990s, and now it's lost. Russia's not going to be playing ball under the Primakov premiership in 1999, and then under Vladimir Putin, Russia's going to go a different way, and Russia's going to be a nationalist rival, really, of the globalization project and the rival of the United States. It's going to come into conflict with the United States from this point on. So this is a big turn that occurs with Russia. So that's important for us charting the history of the globalism paradigm. That's a big point for us to note there, that Russia's on board up until the year 2000 or so. And then after that, Russia is no longer on board. We're going to talk more about the impact of that as we proceed. Secondly, China, quietly rising through this period. You can't say that China is a real opponent of the globalization project, quite the reverse. In fact, they're the leading globalizers, most enthusiastic globalizers in the world. And the general perception in the 1990s was that China is eventually going to be a full-fledged capitalist regime, marching entirely according to globalist neoliberal orders fairly shortly. But that's not of such great consequence in view of the fact that China's economy hasn't really exploded in the way that it's going to do once we get past the turn of the century. So it's for the first decade of the 21st century that we see the curve really rising. So look back in the lectures when I provide you with a graph of the rise of the Chinese national income, and you'll see the point. They're just gathering steam in the 1990s, and past the turn of the century, they will really start a quite explosive growth, which delivers them in, about a quarter of a century, isn't it? It's about 20 years. Delivers them to the position where they're just about the top economy in the world. So it's really, really the most explosive, important thing that we have to talk about from this point on. So there's China. And then there's the question of the euro. How about the euro in competition with the dollar? When we talk about globalism, we could be talking about the dollar, the fate of the dollar and all the rest of that. So the dollar's up against the euro as a possible competitor in the world. And the euro comes into being at the end of the 90s. It's more or less all laid out in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, but it doesn't fully come into use until the end of the 90s. And so that's a key point for us as well. The euro now steps forward, but not at all in the same way that, for example, China steps forward. The Europeans, the Eurozone, so to speak, does not step forward in the same way as a competitor to globalization, or at any rate as a real factor in the world in the same way that the Chinese or the Russians do. The Europeans, the Germans, the European community, the European Union, now it's going to be called, operating under the euro, they have a lot on their plate. They have to worry about all of the economics of the things we're going to be talking about on the one hand. And then secondly, they also have to worry about the geopolitics of the new post-Soviet politics in Europe, and especially this defection of Russia. Presents them with a real difficulty. What are they going to do about this question of Russia? I would think they should have Russia as a natural partner. If the US had permitted Russia into NATO, it would have been the next step for Russia to participate, I think, in the EU. And then what would you have? You'd have a completely different Europe, a completely different kind of a perspective of Europe. And who knows, Europe might have counted for a different quantity when we calculated in world politics. But this is not to be. Russia's on the outside now, and Russia's going to be a rival. Is Russia going to be an equal rival to the EU as it is to NATO? Is that going to be the same thing? So that's not an easy question to answer, and a kind of a tricky one for the European, which they have not worked out to this day. What's their relationship with Russia going to be? And what's tied with that is what's the relationship with the new Europe, so to speak? That is to say, those areas in East Central Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, and the other Balkan states. And some of these are going to be attached to the Eurozone. Poland will not, but the others, the Baltic states, will be attached to the Eurozone. It's not sure what all that means. So you could say that there is no massive euro challenge to the dollar during this period. In fact, there's a kind of a fearful observance of how globalism is working out in the financial field and the economic field over the whole world. And of course, an enormous trepidation set in by the immediate translation of this American financial crisis, and it is an American one, of 2008, the translation of this thing immediately into Europe, because it becomes a global, starts in America, but it becomes a global phenomenon. And then lastly, there's the United States, and its position in the world changed in various ways, of course, but not just by the economic issues, changed by 9/11 in the way that it now has a revisionist attitude toward the Middle East that you can't really see in U.S. policy up to this point. So that too is brand new. So we're going to have a series of military conflicts enveloping the Mideast, and they have not quit until our time. So it's going to be kind of important, and very important to us because a grouping of people in the United States with enormous political influence and a very powerful intellectual weight, the neoconservatives. These people want a very, very active and revisionist policy. Everywhere. They are super patriots and they want the United States active everywhere. But they especially want it in the Mideast. So they want the United States changing borders and rearranging things. A revisionist power in the conventional sense in the Mideast. And they want to get the United States into a lot of things that maybe not everybody, maybe not every expert in the United States thinks the United States is properly ready to take on. Okay, so those are all factors we have to bear in mind talking about this background setting, the geopolitical setting, if you will, to this financial crisis that finally sets in 2008. And in the economic history, of course, it's often referred to as the Great Moderation. Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed for almost 20 years during this, from the end of the 80s to right up to the period just prior to the financial crisis of 2008. So he's the one who has probably popularized more than anybody else this idea that it was a great moderation. So if you look at it in terms of inflation, this graph tells you the story. If you were just looking at it in terms of inflation, and often a lot of the literature would like to have you look at it exactly that way, you can see that there's a certain inflation that sets in up to the Volcker shock, 1981. That's the top end of the graph here. And there's the Volcker adjustment, they call it on the graph, and that brings inflation way down. So we're talking about inflation in the area of 10% on this graph. Actually, inflation was a little worse than that in the United States. But at any rate, the graph tells the story reasonably accurately, I think. And if you look a little closely about this great inflation that the Volcker adjustment is supposed to be a response to, if you look at this great inflation, you can see that the lines, the spikes, more or less carve out the outline of the oil shocks, the same outline the oil shocks would make on the graph. So it's the oil shocks that are causing this inflation. But at any rate, Paul Volcker has got hold of it, and he's created an adjustment with his giant interest rates, enormous interest rates, tremendous deflationary policy, meaning depression, introducing a terrible slump in the United States that lasts through most of the 80s. It lasts right up to the end of the Reagan administration and finally finishes up with a crash in 1987. That's the Volcker adjustment. Then there's the Great Moderation. The graph has a different color to describe this part of the thing, and you see our inflation is down there between 2 and 4%. So that's not bad at all. 2 to 4% inflation is not anything anybody's going to suffer greatly from. In fact, Greenspan found it, considered it a great achievement of his stewardship at the head of the Federal Reserve, the Great Moderation. So if you looked at it entirely in terms of inflation, you'd probably go along with this thought. It's the great moderation thesis, I guess you could call it. And so what would we say about the great moderation idea? You know, that Alan Greenspan really helped to guide the United States through this, idyllic period of stability and prosperity. What's it all based on? It's based on that petrodollar recycling that we were talking about and the global money flows that resulted from that. We've been through this at some length. The strange triangle, it is called by Frieden, not a bad way of putting it. And we've discussed this a lot. That's what it's all based on, the money flows that were established in the 1970s as a result of the oil shocks. And then a further financialization on top of that, as the United States starts to drink in this idea that it lives in an interdependent world and there's a world division of labor, and that the role of the United States is to provide services, and among those services, of course, financial services, first in the ranking. Okay, and that ideologically globalism depends on this notion that Keynesianism has been entirely eclipsed. His old hat, his old doctrine is like an old scientific idea, that has been discarded, and that the new point of view, the new outlook is monetarism, which is preached by Milton Friedman. So we've been talking about this distinction and this quarrel, this ideological, how should I put it, ideological contestation, I guess you'd have to say. We've been talking about this all along, and Keynesianism now appears to be in the great moderation. It's a victory for the Friedman neoliberal perspectives over Keynesianism. Keynes in the ascendant. It's monetarism. That is to say, economic policy should be governed by money policy, by control of the money supply. This means, of course, that deflationary activity is carried out by control of the money supply. That is to say, you lower the money supply and you get deflation, if you want deflation. And that if you are worried about if there's some kind of bad decline in economic activity and there's a reason for you to want to stimulate the economy, you can even do that. And Milton Friedman sets 5% as more or less the limit of that snake. It says that when inflation gets above 5%, well, then we have to start worrying about really cutting the money supply. And when we want to stimulate, we can always stimulate, but never through public works. That's a big difference between the Keynesian outlook and the version of Keynes. I think we could put it that way. The version of Keynes preached by Milton Friedman was really hostile to the essence of Keynesian thinking, because Keynes thinks pretty much the same way Friedman does about money. It's pretty much the same perspectives. Keynes wanted stimulation in the 30s, and one of the ways he wanted to do it was through easy money. But he thought about it in terms of public works as well, integrated with the idea of public works. And there's a famous phrase of Keynes in those days: "Hey, we got to stimulate the economy. The people at the top, they have this liquidity problem. They make a lot of money, but they won't spend it, and so we have to tax them and spend it. The main thing is to get money into the economy, and it almost doesn't matter what you do it for." And as a matter of fact, in an expansive mood, he said, we should dig holes out in the countryside and dump money into it and pay people to dig it up. He was, trying to show that the main thing is to get money, and that's a monetarist argument there. The main thing is to get money into circulation. And Milton Friedman ended up saying something very similar to that, but he said, when we have to get money into the economy, he said, it's like you have to have a helicopter and drop money out of the helicopter into the economy and stimulate it. It seems like that's almost exactly the same thing, but it isn't, is it? It isn't. No, in the first case, you're going to have to dig it up, the Keynesian image, the Keynesian metaphor. You're going to have to dig the money up, so that's public works. You have to actually use the state to organize people to dig the stuff up. You are providing the stimulation. And in the Friedman perspective, and there's no public works in there at all. all you're doing is dumping the money, putting the money, stuffing the money into the pockets of whoever you want to give it to. So monetarism is kind of contained within Keynesianism, but it isn't quite the same thing. It's Keynesianism, Keynesian easy money, or at any rate, Keynesian monetarism, you might even put it, minus public works, minus public works. All right, so what goes with that then? No more business cycle. That from this point on, maybe we have figured out the secrets of the whole problem of international economy, and maybe we won't have depressions anymore. If we free up the economy and permit it to, permit it to organize its spending over on a global scale, if we really lower all the tariff barriers to free trade and really take this as far as it possibly can go, it will have a great moderation that will be broader than just in terms of the inflation rate in the United States, that maybe there won't be any business cycle at all anymore. Well, it won't be any more depressions. That certainly was the perspective of the period that we're talking about. That certainly is the perspective of globalism in its essence. No more business cycle. What goes with it, though, is the idea of a global savings glut. So that's another phrase that Alan Greenspan made famous. So here you see a good graph that illustrates the global savings glut. I think I have a couple of them here. This one does a pretty good job at giving an indication of where the money's going. So you can see on the graph here that in terms of global savings, now this is the money that people make from trade and they make from industry at home. The money that these economies collect, you see it's very considerable, and it's on a considerable increase. It's going from between 35% and 40% in the East Asian economies. So there's the East Asian savings, East Asian portion of the savings gut. And look at the line on the bottom where you see the US portion. So this is just the opposite. So the US portion is languishing. It's down under 20% through most of the period. It doesn't really go anywhere. And but it's a considerable savings. So this is a lot of money that is going to be washing around the world, all this savings. Savings glut, as Greenspan likes to put it, and be looking for ways to invest in new enterprises, new things, new fields. Money looking for a place to implant itself. So it might get into currency. At the end of the 90s in East Asia, it caused a lot of trouble to those East Asian currencies. It might get into all sorts of things. Today we're talking about it getting into real estate in the United States, but there are other things that got into oil among them, which we have to talk about, but we will. So East Asia then, in effect, is the main, how shall I put it, the main beneficiary of the global savings glut. To put it in Greenspan's terms, this cartoon sort of indicates that the East Asian dragon, with the dollar, spitting out the dollar, and wondering, what it's going to do with it. And another way of putting it, almost exactly the same thing, making essentially the same point. You can see the big dip that occurs in 2008 at the time of the financial crisis. So that bites into all of the world's savings, into the savings glut, to continue with this language. And but right after that, it picks up. But still, there's a huge gap between the emergent economies and the advanced economies. The advanced economies are definitely in a subordinate position. Most of the money is being made in Asia. So that is really our story about globalism, isn't it? It's the organization of the entire world, but it's pretty much for the benefit of East Asia. Or I should say Asia and the emerging economies taken generally, not for the benefit of the United States more than they. Most of the money's being made in Asia rather than in the Atlantic, around the Atlantic Ocean. And there's another way of seeing the savings glut, especially if you look at the bar graph on the left. You can see the distribution of the savings glut between Japan, the Euro area, China, but you don't see a bar there for an American distribution, and the Americans, for the most part, are in the deficit category. So this is putting the thing in terms of surpluses and deficits and balances of payments for different countries. You can see the United States is in deficit for the most part, and everybody else is in surplus. What does that mean? Everybody is producing goods for the American market. The American market is the foundation of globalism. Everybody else is going to produce for export. We're going to impose upon them a Washington consensus about their economic policy, which is designed to reorganize their economy for production, organized for export, not for domestic consumption so much as for export. So you have to drop all these older ideas, the import substitution hypothesis and all the rest of that, Raoul Prebisch, all those other things we've been talking about. That's old hat. You have to throw all that out the window. And most of the world pretty much marching according to that music prior to globalism. But now we have an interdependent world, and it looks like it's all designed to be organized around the American market. American export sink, I guess you could call it. So it's their connection to their market that makes them rich, at least as that seems to be shaping up. And then one of the other aspects of this savings glut is all this money that's washing around the world, is that new organizations are getting involved in investments, not just individuals, but in fact it's mainly not individuals, but is mainly organizations, and the hedge fund starts to emerge very powerfully in the 1980s. It gets talked about a lot in the 80s and 90s. And during our period, the first decade of the 21st century, everybody's got used to the idea that the hedge funds have figured out brilliant ways not only to invest their money in all sorts of things that nobody's ever thought of, but also ways to hedge these bets by investing in things that will more or less counter their exposure when things go sour. So these are going to be leading the way then in the world of investment, hedge funds. And there are all sorts of other organizations that are like hedge funds. In fact, even conventional businesses like oil companies, they have a proprietary trading desk, which is doing essentially what a hedge fund is doing. At any rate, it's taking a cue from the hedge funds as to what kind of instruments to invest in and what sort of projects to get involved in. So everybody's starting to act like a bank. And the old-fashioned mutual funds are in there too, but more likely when people talk about investment entities that are leading the way, they talk about hedge funds rather than any other kind. And frequently there comes into popular verb, not popular, but comes into a discussion of these things, an image about a shadow banking system that all these different agencies represent something just like a banking system, but something which is not subject to the same reforms. And that's what's indicated by this cartoon, that whatever regulations there are for banking, and there are less all the time. And remember that at the end of the 90s, there was Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party leading the way to abolish the Glass-Steagall legislation, which limits the activities of banks in the United States. So regulations, even such as they are, when they are applied to banking, they're not applied to shadow banking. And as a matter of fact, what they do is they make it more likely that shadow banking takes up the space that ordinary, old-fashioned, dull banking would take up, regulated banking would take up. So it's this shadow banking which creates a new dynamism in the world economy. Here's another graph that shows the estimate of the shadow bank liabilities, which runs up into the 20 trillion category, as you can see here. And the traditional banks, the dull banks, they are rather considerably below the shadow bank liabilities and activities. So there's a world that's awash, in effect, in money as a result of the deregulation of investing and deregulation of the banks that's been going on for some time, and relaxation of antitrust enthusiasms, for example, to allow huge mergers and even super mergers. And as we go toward the 21st century, big mergers in the 80s, but in the 90s, mega mergers they're talking about, until you finally, I think, at the turn of the century, you get J.P. Morgan and Chase coming together and forming the same entity. I mean, in the history of American banking, those two families are set pretty much against each other. They are pretty much the alternatives at the top of the banking structure, the Rockefellers and the Morgans. And some people make the argument, Nomi Prince has a very good discussion in there of how the Roosevelt administration was pretty much favored by the Rockefellers and their banking and oil interests, pretty much favored by them, and the Morgan interests, a little more closely connected to DuPont and other industrial giants. They took a rather dimmer view of things, and so that somehow she argues that Roosevelt got some degree of support in the elites in the United States as a result of this difference of opinion or this rivalry between those two tenants. Well, can't talk about that anymore. Now they're going to be part of the same organization. So that gives an indication of the extent and the ambition of this merger mentality and its works. All right, so what have we here? This, I believe, is interest rates. Yes, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Interest rates. So here's another way of understanding the thesis of the great moderation. Hold on a second. Let me get the proper pointer. The pen is the one I like. Okay, let's go back. Here are the interest rate interventions that were made, the, how to put it, inflationary interventions. You have to say, made by the Federal Reserve, the cutting of the interest rates made during Greenspan's time in office. And there are a couple of big ones here that I think are worth looking at for our purposes, although I've dimmed up the slide. The numbers are not as legible as they really ought to be. But here's a big spate of interest rate cutting that runs from the period when Greenspan comes into power. So this is right after the crash of '87. And it's during the savings and loan crisis. So they've done away with the regulations in the savings and loan industry. And the savings and loan industry is now competing with other hedge funds, shadow banks, and all the rest of that, and getting involved in steamier and steamier projects until finally they start to go bust. Some of them are criminal projects. And the entire savings and loan industry disappears. Between about 1989, about 1992. And during this whole period, while you see this huge crash in an enormous industry, I had virtually every neighborhood in the Bay Area that I know of, that I remember from my earliest youth, had a big savings and loan there. And, it's a building and loan in the movie, the Frank Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life, that you always see around Christmas. With Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. He's the head of a building and loan company. It's sort of like a bank, but it specializes in mortgages. And so this is a really kind of a ubiquitous institution in the American economic history. They all go bust, and you don't see them anymore. You won't see savings and loans in our neighborhoods anymore. The big one on El Portal, which used to be the American savings and loan, had a big television show. Um, you heard a lot about them. They were always paying for advertising and all the rest of that. Um, that's not there anymore. Um, and this is a time when he cut the interest rates. So this is an example of what people are going to start to call the Greenspan Put. The idea that Alan is always waiting for something to go wrong in the economy, and he's going to counteract it in some way in a monetary fashion or with interest rates. So this is the Greenspan coming to the rescue phenomenon, the Greenspan Put. Okay, so there he is saving the savings and loan industry, at least doing his best to save the savings and loan industry. Then we have another one here, and this is the dot-com bubble at the turn of the century, where he's doing the same thing pretty much. There's been a dot-com crash, and so he's acting against it, cutting interest rates. In each case, he cuts them quite a bit. He goes from 10%, roughly 10% to 3%. That's a huge, gigantic cut, night and day. And then again, he goes from 6%, 6.5%. That's roughly what the interest rates were at the time of the crash in 1929. So that's high in those terms. And down into the 1% category, practically nothing. So that's another big cut, stimulating in effect inflationary policy rather than deflationary policy. And then here perhaps is another one that we have today. Or excuse me, the other one that we have to talk about today. We have to talk about today, the crisis of 2008, where he takes another series of measures to bring the interest rates down. Inflationary, stimulating activity on the part of the Federal Reserve using the interest rate. But here's another interesting phenomenon that we ought to take note of that doesn't get enough attention, in my opinion. This series of interest rate rises, if you look closely at these lines, you'll see these little step-by-step increments. So the interest rate is risen by, a quarter of a percent every so often, and it amounts to a tremendous numbers of, but overall, it's an enormous increase in interest rates. So you see, he went up between 2004 or so, and right up to the time of the crash, he went up into the 6% category right there. So that's comparable. I will be arguing. That's comparable to what the banks did prior to the Great Depression in 1920, prior to the crash in 1929. And that brought down the whole stock market at that time. So this is kind of similar here. And maybe this is a mini Volcker shock. It's another thesis I would like to introduce. It doesn't appear in the literature, but it's worth talking about, in my opinion. A little mini Volcker shock. Maybe he's trying to raise interest rates for some other reason, maybe to counteract the price of gold rising during this period. Let's talk about that as we proceed. Price of gold and maybe the price of oil. Let's talk about the price of oil. So here's a very detailed, very well annotated history of crude oil prices. But a lot of these annotations are not things we can take very seriously, but especially the ones at the far right of the diagram. I'll talk about that in a minute. But as you can see, here's our familiar profile here. We have the first oil shock, and then a certain hiatus, and then the second oil shock. Then here's the Volcker shock with the high interest rates, and look how it brings down these oil prices. So we've gone over this terrain quite a bit, and you should have it fairly clearly in mind by now. And then later on, there's another increase. So here's something we have to chart that doesn't get its proper due. There's an enormous rise in the price of oil. So, I mean, if you look at it in terms of the first two oil shocks, it looks like the third oil shock. Is the third oil shock um, the reason for the crash of 2008? Or another way of putting this, is the third oil shock the prompting for Federal Reserve action of a deflationary character, that's say raising the interest rates, and by those steps we just looked at, which caused the crash? Deflationary action can cause a lack of confidence. People who have money in the stock market every day are looking in the papers. They see the interest rates have gone up. They're hokey moly. This bonanza maybe is not going to last forever. The Federal Reserve is trying to deflate. Now, today the market didn't care and it continued to go up, but let's take note of these things, especially for the next time we see a rise in interest rates, see if we can note a trend here and start to wonder if maybe now's the time to get into cash, get out of this thing, because we don't want to take the roller coaster ride on the other side of it, on the other side of the peak. We want to get out before we get to the peak. So that's what creates the panic. It's those interest rate rises, and that does not need explanation, strictly speaking, especially for us in terms of all the things that we've been talking about in this course. Here's another graph which rather more simplified and with very inadequate annotation here, in my opinion, to describe what we've just been talking about, the presumed third oil shock here. So here's the third oil shock happening, and how are they explaining it? They're saying prices rise on OPEC cutbacks and increased demand. Increased demand. Does that mean people are using more gas or something like that? And then a worker strike in Venezuela. Wow, key event there. I wonder about this annotation and how reliable it will be, how much it will help us to understand this thing. I'm going to offer something that I think may be more satisfying, or I hope it will be more satisfying. At any rate, the point of the matter is that the Greenspan Put essentially provided bailouts for the 1987 crash, for the savings and loan crash in 89 to 92, for the dot-com crash at the turn of the 21st century. You might say that this comes under the heading of what is normally called moral hazard. Moral hazard. The idea that if there's no risk in something, that does not strictly cohere with our ideas of a free market. That in a free market, there really ought to be a risk, and you really ought to pay the price when you lose. A casino in which there is a person who greets you at the end of the, when you exit the casino, and who makes good your losses. Gee, that's no fun, and that's doesn't make any sense. Well, certainly doesn't make any sense for the casino. But this is a casino, or starting, at least with the Greenspan Put, we have to wonder if this isn't a casino where your losses are guaranteed. And if you lose money, somebody will make it up, make you whole again. Moral hazard then. If there is an instance of moral hazard here, we have to say that it applies, perhaps in general, to the biggest financial institution in the world, the Federal Reserve, the world central bank, according to globalism, and this massive world money wash that is being created, this savings glut over the whole world, all this money, it doesn't know where to go. Where's it going? Well, maybe it's going into the oil price boom. The US has just invaded Iraq in 2003, privatizing Iraq from A to Z. Iraq was pretty much a socialist economy. Maybe 2/3 of the employees worked for the state. Socialist, pretty much a socialist scene, all going to be privatized. And it's going to be open for business. The oil, it turns out that they're going to leave most of the oil to the Iraqis, but the new oil the reserves, in other words, the new oil that's going to be taken out, that's going to be open to foreigners, foreign oil companies who are going to be able to get a share of that. So there's a great deal of excitement associating with those ideas. And maybe this oil glut, or excuse me, maybe this oil price boom, this third oil shock we're talking about, maybe that is one of the suspects that we should put up there when we ask the question, where's all this money going to go? I mean, there's something going to oil prices, and maybe that's a way of explaining, or it helps us, we poor historians, trying to figure these things out and not getting as much help from the economists as we would like. But maybe that's helps us to understand the thing. Maybe that's where all that money is going. And one of the other places it starts to go with this, we know, is into the real estate market in the United States, and especially into the subprime market. That is to say, not very good, not very trustworthy, excuse me, not very trustworthy mortgages. Mortgages to questionable people who are maybe not so qualified as might be hoped. Subprime mortgages in the United States. So poor people maybe who are listening to the radio and hear somebody come on and say, come on, take one of our mortgages, and you've always wanted to have a house of your own, get one of our mortgages and do it on an adjustable rate basis. You don't have to pay any interest on it for a year or maybe 2 years. But then maybe, of course, something they don't stress, after that, the payments go way up. So maybe you can afford it for 2 years, 3 years, and the payments have gone way, way up. And maybe you can't afford it from that point, but maybe if you're nimble enough, you can perform some improvements on the thing and flip it, turn it over, buy it, and then sell it before these mortgage payments become onerous. That's the temptation, I guess, in the subprime market. So not only is there a kind of a low-end mortgage market out there into which a lot of this money can go, but the financial geniuses who are developing globalization as they go and who are constantly inventing new products, new ways of providing options to the investor, new bets, you could argue. It's fairly easy for them to get into this thing too, and to start taking these mortgages and trying to broaden them into generalized instruments by slicing up portions of them. So creating an instrument that contains a certain fraction of a number of mortgages, and of different composition, high-end ones, low-end ones, middling ones, and then selling them to people. And then people are free to bunch these together and sell them. These are just investments that are just cooked up out of the brains of these bet makers, bet offerers, essentially. And they go under the general heading of derivatives, meaning they're not exactly real investments, but they're invented investments that are derived from other investments. And they can get insanely complicated. I have not got the competence, and practically nobody who writes on this has got really genuine experience with trade in derivatives or the construction of derivatives or all of that. Many people simply write about their effects, and we're forced to do the same thing. So I'm not talking, this is not a course in business, and we're not telling you how to do this, how to get rich doing this, or any of that. We're just noting it and how it impacts history. But all of these derivatives, tremendous new market is created in the trillions and trillions, all based on the ability of the kind of not very well-heeled a mortgage holder to make his payments every month. So there's a fairly interesting proposition there. And this cartoon kind of tries to describe that point that everybody in the world, Wall Street, all got an interest in somebody making his payments, just on some modest little house out in the suburbs. Um, so there we have it. The large heading for this term is the securitization of the mortgage market. So this exploded during this period. Um, and so alongside the oil price boom, we have to note this securitization of the um, real estate market. Um, and you can see what a big portion, the subprime real estate, based on these derivatives, makes up of the entire mortgage market. It got as high as 23%, according to this graph, um, during the height of the crisis. And of course, afterward, you see it all collapses. Everybody loses their house. People all go bust. Everybody's involved in these derivatives. They all take a big beating. All the big banks are involved in it, so they take a big beating. And a lot of them are involved in buying and selling these instruments, packaging and repackaging them, because it turns out that this is the kind of ingenuity that makes money in the era of financialization. So this is something we cannot really see at work the way we would like to, but something that we have to take note of, or we won't really understand globalization. The real result of globalization has been financialization, and the real result of that has been the securitization of these fairly modest instruments, uh, subprime mortgages. Student loans explode during this period. So they get into oil, they get into uh, um, uh, subprime mortgages, derivatives, student loans. So loan to students, they need money. And these are all exploding things. They are all arms. Um, um, Adjustable rate mortgages are all set by LIBOR, the London Interbank Rate. We know now that the LIBOR settings during this period were not entirely legit. They were kind of corrupted, and there's a great deal of scandal associated with it that we don't read about. It's a bit of an embarrassment these days. But at any rate, this is the basis, indicating what you pay when you borrow money. Um, Start out paying a little, but you may end up paying a lot. So here, this graph shows the explosion in student loans during this period. And it even continues. I mean, really, it's not affected by the crash at all. As you see, the crash is indicated in 2008, and student loans continued to explode from this point on. Okay, so my argument would be that what we are seeing here is an attempt by Alan Greenspan to cut against these things, because the gold price starts to be driving up during this period. So the Greenspan is in power here, and he's watching this gold price come up, and he's going to have to do something about it. Eventually, this gold price is going to continue. It's going to track what's happening with oil. We've seen this before, so we shouldn't be surprised at this. And that's what we're going to see Alan Greenspan trying to take some measures against. Here's another graph that shows the same thing, maybe in more vivid terms. I think the important thing is not to see it adjusted for inflation, but just to look at the numbers themselves as they would have been originally reported in the media as the thing happened. And that's important for us historians. Look at this lower line, the lower black line, and you see the third oil shock shaping up, but it's a gold shock. Strictly speaking, the price of gold has been driven down by the Fokker action, the Fokker shock, and in fact, this is the whole point of it, to get the the gold price down. And now oil prices are going up, and gold prices are going up too. So Greenspan has to act about this gold thing. That's the value of the dollar. He's got to protect the value of the dollar. First thing he has to think about is the interest rate rises, and maybe that's our explanation for the why it is the crash happened. So here are his incremental steps. I think they're 14 in number, something like that, when he starts to think that maybe the thing's getting out of hand, or at any rate, we want to act against this rise in the price of gold. This is a repeat of the Volcker shock, except it's on a little smaller scale, but it's going to have much more, much different consequences. In fact, it's going to have a completely opposite consequence from the Volcker shock. He inflicted a depression on the United States, but not a crash of the type that we see in 2008. And so that's where things went sour for poor Alan Greenspan. He must have thought that he was doing something similar to what Volcker had done, and it's all going to turn out splendidly as it did for Volcker. Of course, a lot of things intervened, a lot of things make the case different for Volcker. Those are fascinating problems for the historian, largely untouched, virgin soil for historians. They really should get into this and have fun and discuss it and explicate it for us. But at any rate, there are his interest rate rises, and that's the crash. So the interest rates go up, just like in 1929, they go up, and then boom, they crash. The investors eventually get wind. And then, of course, they have other inputs. They're looking at the numbers of defaults. These poor fellows at the bottom who have to pay off these mortgages. You know, there's a percentage of defaults. It gets above 7%, and they start to get kind of nervous about it. And maybe people start getting out of it, getting into cash. The investors who are holding these derivatives, these collateralized debt obligations, they're usually called. Oh, and there's another little wrinkle that we've hardly even mentioned. There's the fact that another invention from this period, the credit default swap was invented, and that's basically insurance for investments. No matter how unsound these investments are, you can buy insurance on them and get paid off. Who is going to issue such insurance? Well, it turns out there's a firm, AIG, that's leading the pack. Talk about a risky business. Well, it's not risky if you accept the assumption that prices never go down. We're not going to have slumps anymore. The business cycle is transcended, superseded, etc. But you have to work on that assumption in order to believe in credit default swaps or be in the credit default swap business. On the other hand, if things go well, it's easy money. It's like insurance, like any other kind of insurance, I suppose, but this is an especially iffy insurance. And you know, it's understandable that nobody ever thought of it up to this time, but there it is, the credit default swap. So these are these two, how shall we put it, enormously innovative. That's the best thing we can say about them. Enormous innovations in the wizardry of finance during this period, the credit default swap. All right, so then our argument will be, we'll ask the question, who blew the whistle on all this? And our working hypothesis is Alan Greenspan, and he was acting not because of the default rates or any of that he was acting because he was worried about the gold price. In other words, the most conventional argument. Occam's razor, we like the simplest explanation, and we start there. We'll go on to the more complicated explanations once we have rejected the simple one. And so we're trying to look at this exactly the same way as we looked at the Volcker shock, and it's same outlines, same picture, roughly same picture in general. And we're trying to be sympathetic to Alan Greenspan and trying to see the world pretty much the way he must have seen it. And this towering action of Volcker, the miracle working action of Volcker, he must have been influenced by that, must have been trying to continue in that vein. It only makes sense. At any rate, it's a first hypothesis in trying to understand these things, which seem so mysterious otherwise. All right, so there's the crash itself. So you can see the Dow Jones absolutely plummeting. And so that curve is a kind of interesting curve. If you were watching television in those days, you could just sit and watch them looking at every stock exchange and looking at every individual firm, and this will almost be exactly the same curve, this constant loop, or I should say this consistent loop, this And then, of course, this takes it through the period of the failure of the first TARP vote, which you saw illustrated in the movies. The Toxic Assets Relief Program, renamed the Troubled Assets Relief Program. These troubled assets, those are those derivatives and all those invented things, which the world is still awash in those things even today. But those were the things that had to be bought up, essentially. Bad debts that have to be bought up by the government. That's what's involved with this bailout. And so there you see the crash actually unfolding on the Dow, to the chagrin of all of the people who are intimately involved in this. So they're not just individuals, but the heads of big firms. Because every big firm wants to get into this thing, wants to be part of it. A very interesting article that I ran across the Financial Times, 2005, lamented the fact that the bankers had not got into this thing, into the investment game in the same way the hedge funds did. That hedge funds are making a killing, essentially, just with their cleverness, and that the banks do an essentially dull business, and they're not taking part of it. And there's a temptation for banks to try to do better, and to try to imitate the hedge funds. So that's the phenomenon that we're talking about when we talk about the shadow banking thing. And so these are legit banks, though. They're not shadow banks, but they're trying to act like shadow banks. And so the biggest, most respected firms, the biggest names you can think of on Wall Street, all dug into this thing in a very big way. And naturally, of course, they're really suffering. Now, if it had been 1929, you would have seen some of these gentlemen standing on the ledges of big buildings and jumping off rather than face what was going to happen to them. But no suicides in this thing. That model's not going to apply. All these people are going to get saved. Saved, they're going to make money on it. I should put it more strongly. They're going to make a killing. Most of them are going to do brilliantly as a result of the massive bailout and the quantitative easing. So not only does Congress come to the rescue, but the Federal Reserve backs up the activity of Congress, and then the firms. That creates a nice little scenario where the people who've been lent, all the big bankers who've been lent all this money, they can pay it back and say it was only temporary. They got the money in the back door from Ben Bernanke. So there you see the stock market crash at its peak. We're talking about household net worth that they're estimating here in the 70 trillion category with the T, and diving into a trough of a mere, so to speak, 50 or so trillion. Quite a loss. And the way this affects the ordinary family net worth during this period, you can see it's a drop from around 140 to 83. So this is a big drop. Who's paying for this thing? Our question, and the answer is ordinary folks, not the fellows who might have been jumping off of tall buildings. Otherwise, not them. But ordinary folk are going to absorb this thing, and it's going to add to a terrific poverty as a result of it. It's all the work of Ben Bernanke. So all over the world, Ben Bernanke, who has taken over from Alan Greenspan and who presides over this thing. As you saw in the film, he's in the background. Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, is doing all the negotiating and doing all the wire pulling, basically, with his confreres, Timothy Geithner and others. But Ben Bernanke is standing in the background. He represents the Fed. So let the Treasury, arrange this whole thing. And the Treasury really has to engage in the politics of it, has to sell it politically. And Ben Bernanke's not doing that, but he's going to pay for it in the end. The Fed is going to pay for it. So all over the world, Ben Bernanke, and this says QE2, there's a there used to be a cruise ship. That was the Queen Elizabeth, which was the second a successor to an original one. It was called the QE2. So here they're talking about these various tranches of quantitative easing. So the first one was QE1, second was QE2. This was an attempt at humor on that idea, the QE2. There he's tossing money off the deck of the QE2. Here's another way of describing quantitative easing. You, with one hand, you toss money at the investors, and with the other one, you cross your fingers behind your back. Or this cartoon talks about Ben Bernanke just talking about how you have to have faith that what you're going to put in on one end is going to come out the other end. Now there's an interesting point. Selling this to the public, you have to tell them that this is absolutely essential for the functioning of the economy. And of course, nobody wanted a lasting crash and a depression to follow on the model of 1929. So the thing had to be sold with the argument, which I must say I heard from a number of people at the time, that, gee, this is a real mess, and it involves a certain amount of, how to put it, even corruption, trying to get the votes in Congress to pass this TARP legislation, collaring a senator or a congressman from such an area and saying, oh, we'll help you with this if you will vote for us on our TARP. There was quite a bit of that, but all justified by saying that, gee, if we don't do this, the whole economy will tank. By the way, same argument used for bailing out Mexico in 1994. For almost any time the government is doing these bailouts, same argument, it's a mess. Can't exactly justify it under normal terms, certainly not our notions of moral hazard. But if we don't do it, we'll go under because the banks are the real basis. They really run the whole economy, and we got to have them. Too big to fail. The final argument. Too big to fail. We have to ask if that's right. If it's really true that all of the investment in the country has to be organized in this way. And there's no other way to do it. There is no alternative is the idea. I'm not in a position to pass on that notion, but it's highly questionable, I think. And then in theory, Bernanke, who studied the Great Depression and certainly knows Milton Friedman's writings on it, he said a money finance tax cut is essentially equivalent to Milton Friedman's famous helicopter drop, so to speak, of money. That's certainly right. So he did this by citing the orthodoxy of Milton Friedman's monetarism, the helicopter drop. And sure enough, here's an Ingram Pin cartoon for the Financial Times saying that's exactly what they're doing. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, and not just they, the European Central Bank, speaking for the euro, and the Japanese central bank speaking for the yen. They're doing the same thing. They are backing the truck up to the helicopter and putting the money in. And this cartoon has a Ben Bernanke action figure. You can drop money out of a helicopter. And more jokes about quantitative easing, which to the naked eye appears to be simply stuffing money into the pockets of the bettors in this casino whose bets went sour without helping anybody else, without forcing them to fire anybody, chastise anybody, cut any salaries, eliminate any bonuses, none of that, all in the Obama administration because of the intimacy of Obama's relationship with Tim Geithner, who had been the head of the New York Federal Reserve, and of course speaks more prominently for the Federal Reserve than anybody else, except for Bernanke himself. And then an interesting cartoon, which kind of gives us a coda for the end of our discussion, which has to come. You'll be relieved to hear. That in the end, we are asked to have faith somehow. And those who have carried this whole operation out, they are grateful for the confidence that has been placed in them. At the time that this happened in Washington, though, it's very important, this often gets overlooked, very important to note that it did seem like a worldwide phenomenon, except for the fact that it had to be pointed out, and it was pointed out repeatedly, that this is an American financial crash, and it's affecting Europe and the Atlantic world, maybe, the world of the dollar and the euro. But there's a decoupling. That's the phrase that was usually used, a decoupling, meaning that elsewhere in the world, especially in emerging markets, and especially in Asia, and especially in China, the punishment was not so severe as it was in the rest of the world. So there's a decoupling. The crash only happened in half the world. The crash did not happen among the emerging countries. That in China, they did not follow Milton Friedman, they followed John Maynard Keynes. They followed it with a big expenditure of money designed to stimulate. They took some losses at first as a result of this, but then they acted against the downward pressures by engaging in some expenditures of their own on a very conventional Keynesian type, and which did not exclude public works. They popped right out of the thing and minimized their losses and continued their growth. So the Chinese believed in the church that had been rejected by the West, the Keynesian perspective. They remained Keynesians. And then another question was raised at the end of this thing, why was it that this thing had to be followed by continued faith in monetarism, by a recovery that was jobless, that the quantitative easing that went into the hands of the investors in big firms that had, on the basis that they were going to reinvest it and get the economies rolling again, the real economies, it's never materialized. And they continued to invest in the same way that they had prior to the thing. And we had depression type conditions. And the answer was that we have to tighten our belts. That austerity followed. Monetarism, jobless recovery, it was called in the media. Jobless recovery. It's pretty good. How could it be a real recovery if it was jobless? In which you got your money from the Federal Reserve, you used it to buy back your own stock in order to increase the value of your stock on the stock exchange. And that's it. So the stock exchange recovered, but the real economy did not. Once again, I'm still marching under the Friedmanist paradigm rather than the Keynesian, as in the Far East. So it raised the question, even under these new conditions, this is a screwy thought, but many of us had it, and it continues to be had, and you can see it a little bit in how we are reacting to the COVID crisis, something we will talk about later. This notion that as long as you're doing quantitative easing of this type, why can't you do it in some other way? I say, why can't you use quantitative easing to provide relief? Why can't you just send everybody a paycheck, a universal basic income, or something else? Public works, I would say. I'd be the first one in the line that was forming for the public works alternative. So this quantitative easing opens up a number of questions. Moreover, it lets the cat out of the bag. Practically nobody talked about the role of the Federal Reserve in creating money to the same degree that they talk about it now. So this is a big change in the West, and something I want to talk more about. I haven't got time to really pursue it here. We do have to ask the question, though, what's happening in the real world while all this stuff is going on in the world of financialization? Bear in mind that we're only talking about passing paper around, basically, the crises that are caused by passing paper around. And I know that this is the main way that globalization makes money, but there are other ways of making money. There are ways of actually running an economy, hiring wage labor, paying wages, turning out a product, selling it in the market. The old-fashioned way of making money. The real economy continues to move along through all of this crisis in the financial economy. And if you look at this bar graph, which gives us an indication of the world GDP growth breakdown among China, United States, other rich countries, other emerging markets, you can see that the blues, as opposed to the red hues, the red and pink hues, are rather modest. And then look especially at the year 2008 in this graph, where you see the GDP growth for the United States in the negative. And that never happens. You see it declining for China and the other emerging societies, but it doesn't go down that far. And you almost get the impression that they are the ones around which globalization is beginning to center. Raise the question whether globalization in the real economy now, while we have this financialized regime running it all, that in the real economy at the core of the world system, that the Asian countries, they are the ones who are continuing to grow and to prosper. And it is the countries, the centers of financialization, and they are the ones who seem to be losing out. These, by the very rules of globalization that they, the latter, set for us, something we've been tracing through the whole course. When this system, globalism, works properly, it works best for the Chinese, I guess. Is that the lesson that emerges from all of this? Are they the only ones to emerge unscathed from this enormous crash that whose effects we're still living in? Has all of this shaped up in such a way that it is merely a passing on of the baton, merely a dramatization of the process of the West and the United States at its core, passing on the baton to the East, China at its core? So that's a question that this whole thing leaves us with, one of the many questions, but an important one for our purposes that this thing leaves us with. We can't answer it now, but as we proceed, our next block of discussion will have to do with this question of whether China isn't the big winner, or as Kishore Mahbubani argues it, whether China hasn't already won. And that's a question we have to answer, but not today. So we'll take that on next time.